Hey Sean,
Yeah.
you make me melt.
This one is going to be cheesy. We are going to create type out of cheese only using a cube inside Cinema 4D. I recently had to find a way to make this melting cheese look, and I thought I would share a couple of the tricks I learned to help you guys get started. We'll have a play around with some of the sculpting tools, but ultimately let the melt deformer do a lot of the heavy lifting. Alright, let's have a look at how this all comes together. Cheers. Hey guys, so today I thought for something a bit different, I'll show you the final scene we've got here, and then we'll dive in and I'll show you how we can simply start to build up this melting cheese look. So in my scene here, I've lit it with a HDR studio rig for that final look. I've got a stage here, which is just our cube, which our melting cheese is sitting on. We've got our melt here, and then just that thumbnail camera that you've seen. Now if I jump out of here and we'll have a bit of a spin around, you can see we've got this nice melting cheese melting over our stage there. Now we've built this up using some of the sculpting tools. So you can see on our melt here, we've got a sculpt tag. Now that tag holds all the data from all the sculpting we're going to do. So if we remove that, we get back to our base mesh. So this is the kind of look that we're going to be aiming for to create initially, and then we'll start enhancing it with those sculpt tools. So let's jump in and I'll show you how we can start to build this up just using a cube. Now let's open up a new scene, and to build up these text, we could use a MoText object, but what I like to do is think of ways to build up text just using shapes to create some nice interesting looks. So a great way we can start to build up this C is to use a couple of splines. So first up, let's grab ourselves a circle spline. I'm going to pull this up 200 units just so our base is on the ground there. The next thing I'll do is drop a spline wrap into our scene. Now like I said, we're going to build this geometry using a cube. So let's drop a cube into our scene as well. Let's now make our spline wrap a child of that cube. And in the spline parameter here of the spline wrap, let's just drop that circle spline. Now straight away, we're not going to really see a lot. We need to start to add some segments to our cube. So let's start to increase our segments along X and Y here. If I hit NB, that will reveal our polygons for us. So we can start to see how detailed we need to make this. Now in my spline wrap, I'm going to change my mode from fit spline to keep length. And now rather than stretching the geometry, it's just going to wrap what we set our cube to be along that circle. Now what we can do is start to increase our size along X. Grab our circle spline, let's rotate this a bit, and now you can see we're starting to create that C shape that's going to be the basis of our geometry. Let's hide our spline wrap in our circle, just so we can see our geometry nicely in our scene here. What I'm going to do is decrease our segments just a little bit, so we've got a lower poly mesh here. So what I'm going to do is drop my cube into a subdivision surface, and you can see this now, and this now smooths all our geometry. We can turn that off for the moment. We don't need to see all our geometry, but this is going to come in handy a bit later. So let's group that into a null. Let's rename that subdivision surface our C. Let's grab a melt deformer and let's drop it into this hierarchy. I'm just going to put our subdivision surface on top of our melt. You can see what the melt is doing. If I start to play with the strength here, it starts to melt all our geometry towards the ground. Now this is kind of cool, but it's not that final look that we're going for. What we want to do is just have the base of our text here melting onto the ground. So what we can do in our melt is actually give it a fall off. So in our shape here, let's give it a linear fall off, and I'm going to change my orientation to +Y. And now with my melt deformer selected, I can pull this up along Y, and you can see it starts melting that geometry. Maybe reposition it a little bit on X there, just so it melts evenly away from the middle. And now what we can do is come in and start to have a bit of a play with some of the properties in our melt here. Now what's great with this melt is you can really start to play with these numbers with no real consequence of bogging down your scene. So you can have a bit of a play and get a look that really works well for you. What I found worked really nicely was having plenty of that randomness in our radial there. Now you can see I'm not using a massive strength of my melt because we just want to create a nice shape here to start working with so we can sculpt on this. I'm just repositioning it a little bit so it melts evenly from the center, and I think we're starting to get a nice base of a shape now for us to start working with. And I think this is looking pretty good. We've already got some randomness on our edges. It's already starting to look like a bit of a melting letter. This is a great start for us, and we've done it with just a couple of simple steps. Now that we've got our base set up, you might like to make a copy of your setup because we are about to make it editable. I'm just going to drop a plane in here, scale it up a little bit, and this is going to become our floor, something for our melting cheese to sit on. Now this is looking good, but the spline wrap allows us to add a bit more interest to our shape here. So let's jump into our spline wrap, come down to our rotation, and I'm just going to play with our curve here. And you can see now we're getting this nice bend in our letter, and it just creates this nice drooping look. Just adds a bit more interest to your scene. So don't be shy to jump into your spline wrap and have a play with these curves on the rotation and the scale, and you can create some really interesting looks. Alright, this is looking good. It's time to start sculpting. So what I'm going to do is collapse my null here, and I'm going to drop it into a connect. And now with my connect selected, if I hit C, it now collapses all that geometry, so we've just got one object. And now comes the fun part of diving in and having a bit of a play with some of the sculpting tools. Now with our C melt selected, let's hit subdivide. And this isn't going to subdivide our geometry, it's just going to apply a sculpting tag to it. And this is going to allow us to start sculpting onto our C melt. So the first thing I'm going to do is using our grab tool with quite a large radius here. I'm just going to start working around the edges and grabbing it and moving it into different positions just to enhance what the melt has already done for us. Now, just as we did with the grab tool, I'm using the knife tool to accentuate what's already there. We can see this shape is already starting to happen from the base here. So with the knife tool, I'm just gonna make a nice cut along that edge, dive back into our grab tool, and then we can start pulling those points along a little bit, start enhancing that drip. And this is looking good. Let's grab our smooth tool now, and we'll just work along our cut line we made with that knife tool. And now we've got this nice smooth geometry looking like nice melted cheese. We can continue that step all the way along the base, adding new cuts with our knife tool, smoothing it out, grabbing that base, pulling it along a little bit, and that's starting to look really cool. What I might even do is just make another cut with our knife at the back base there, just to add a little bit more detail. Alright, let's leave our base there for the moment. We'll come back and add a bit more detail in a moment. What I want to start having a bit of a play with now is adding in those holes into the top of our cheese that really start to sell this look. So what I'm going to do for this is using the pull tool. Now what the pull tool does is pulls geometry towards you. You can see here when I start to apply a bit of pressure to our geometry, it starts to create this nice bubble look towards us, but that's not quite what we need here. But what we can do with our pull selected, we can come down into our properties here and invert this. And now when I apply pressure to our geometry, it creates this nice crevice into our geometry, and this is going to be great for selling that cheese look. All right, let's zoom in on our geometry here. I like to have the plane I'm working on facing me just to be able to have more control of making this shape. So I'm just going to slowly work that pull tool into our geometry to create a bit of a welt. And then what I do to really sell this look, you'll notice with cheese it's actually got quite a sharp line as it goes into these welts. So by using the pinch tool, we can work along that outside line, pinching this geometry together and create a sharper edge. We don't have to be too careful here. We don't have to be creating a perfect circle. Cheese has these organic shapes. They're not perfect, so we don't have to be either. We can just have a bit of fun with this. All right, that one's looking good. Let's make another one on the inside here. Using that pull tool again, making a nice crevice into our geometry, just slowly working that pressure along. Grabbing that pinch tool again, this time we might just have to decrease our size a little bit. You just got to play with your size based on the scale of the hole you're making. So I'm just going to work that pinch tool along the outside of my circle again. Now you might notice when you start to make these smaller holes, you get this artifacting in your geometry, but don't stress about that because you can drop that into a subdivision surface and look at that, you get this nice smooth edge again. Let's turn that subdivision surface back off. We'll use it for the final render, but for now we don't need that level of detail while we're making these shapes. Let's jump back to our camera. I like to do this to start to see where would another shape be good. And what can look really cool is if you start to work these shapes into the edges of your geometry as well. So let's spin around our geometry, square up on an edge here, and just start using that pull tool again to create a nice welt into our edge here. And now that we're happy with that shape, we'll grab our pinch tool again, working along those outside edges to create a nice sharp line for us. All right, let's jump back to our camera and you can see that nice detail in the top there. This is starting to look really cool for us. Now what I might do is add a couple of extra dents into our geometry here. You've seen how I've done it now. Have a bit of a play yourselves. I'm going to speed through these next couple and then we'll dive into the next tip. All right, now that we're starting to get happy with the shape we're creating here, I think it's time to start having a bit of a look at the textures. One thing I like to do when I'm trying to sell a real object is to use real reference. So for reference here, I've got myself a photo of some cheese, and I'm going to use this to drive our color. So with our color selected, I can use our eyedrop tool and actually select a pigment in this photo, and that color is now applied to our geometry. Now it might be a bit hard for you to see, but in the reference shot here, we've got some nice detail in this cheese. So the way I'm going to start to build this up is by using a bump. Now with my bump turned on, I'm going to add a noise into my text channel here. And already, by the way, this default noise is being applied to our cheese. It's creating some nice interesting detail. But what we can do is dive in and start to play with the scale of this noise, even throw in another noise if we would like. Alright, of course, we need to add some reflection, so let's go into our reflectance channel here, add a Beckman, give it a bit of Fresnel. But we're going to really dial this down. This doesn't need to be really reflective, and of course we'll give it some roughness because cheese gives off that blurry reflection. It doesn't give perfect reflections. Now, like in that piece you saw at the beginning, I was using a HDR Studio rig, so let's drop one of them into our scene. We can actually hide our floor now because the HDR rig comes with a floor. Let's insert some render settings just to have a bit of a look at what we're working with. I'll hit render on my viewport and you can already see that our noise scale is far too big. We need to really scale that down to help sell this look. So let's open up our texture here, jump into our bump, and I'm going to scale this down by 50% and also decrease our strength. Perhaps this isn't the right noise. What I'm going to do is change that default noise to a turbulence, and let's have another look at what we've got here. I think that scale is working better for us. I think we didn't need as much strength. Okay, now that we're happy with this, let's jump back into our sculpting layout and start to have a bit more of a play with the base here. So the first thing I'll do is remove our geometry from our subdivision surface, and let's jump back into our sculpting layout. Now somewhere along the lines I stuffed up this geometry and I made this welt in the front here, and I think we're just going to have to move past that. I don't know what I've done, but what I might do is try and correct it a little bit here. So I'm just using the grab tool, moving that geometry around a bit. I had a bit of a play with the smoothing tool as well, but what I want to show you is how we can add a nice dripping effect to the edge here. So the way I'm going to do this is by using the inflate tool. And what I'll do is just simply work my way along the outside edge of our geometry here, and you can see it just starts inflating it, creating this nice dripping look for us. We haven't really been focusing on the back edge here, but it's a quick process working along here. But I'll just use this inflate tool and continue this process all the way around the outside edge of our geometry. And this is already starting to look really cool for us. Our geometry is sitting on the ground there. These drips are organically going off into different directions thanks to that melt deformer we used. And by diving in and having a play with some of these sculpting tools, we're able to create a really interesting look really quickly. Let's jump back into our camera, and what we might like to do is start to use this inflate tool and start to create some really bulbous drips on some of these ones that are facing towards the camera. Now that we've started to inflate the edges here, you can see some of the geometry is starting to pass back through the floor there. So I'll use the grab tool, just working along the edge here, and just start moving that geometry back up on top of the floor we've set. Let's drop our geometry into that subdivision surface again, and let's have a look at what we've been able to create with just a couple of simple tools. We've got these nice drips, we've got these nice crevices into our cube to really sell this cheese look. So there's hopefully just a couple of simple tips on how you can start to dive in and have a play creating this look. Let's jump back over into our final scene, having a look at what we ended up with here. And this was just using that exact same technique. This is that finished product. I just took it a little bit further, really playing with those drips, pulling them down along that cube, inflating them, making them look really heavy as if they were dripping off this cube. And I hope you guys can take something away from this. Just a couple of simple tips, a real fun way to sell this technique, and a way to start thinking a bit differently about text and build it up using shapes rather than always defaulting to the MoText object. All right, thanks guys. I'll see you again real soon. Cheers.